In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the lymphatic system and the structures and some of the functions of the lymphatic system, which is all part of the innate defenses that humans have. So the function of the lymphatic system is, there's a couple of them. The first is that it collects the excess tissue fluids that accumulates in extracellular spaces. And so this interstitial fluid is fluid that is squeezed out of capillaries but never makes it back in. And so the lymphatic system collects that tissue fluid and transports it back to the cardiovascular system, puts it back into the blood. It also transports digested fats from the small intestine to the blood. So while most of the nutrients that are digested at the small intestine get directly transported into blood, the fats have to go first into the lymphatic system and then get delivered into blood. And then finally, it's involved in many of the innate and the adaptive defenses. And so that's where we're going to be focusing on it in this chapter. So as I mentioned, pressure of excess tissue fluid pushes lymphatic fluid into the lymphatic capillaries, and this forms lymph. Lymph is very similar to the plasma of blood, with the exception that it doesn't have all the plasma proteins that we associate with blood plasma. But it does have nutrients, it has bacteria, it has anything that is in the blood or in the tissues is going to be found in lymph. Excuse me. So these capillaries, the lymphatic capillaries, lead to larger lymphatic vessels. And as the lymph travels through these vessels, it also filters through lymph nodes. The lymph nodes are these swellings that you see in the pathway of the lymphatic vessels. And so there's a lot of filtering action, and we'll talk about that in just a second, that occurs as the lymph flows through lymph nodes. The lymphatic vessels lead to larger and larger vessels until eventually they collect at the right lymphatic duct. That's everything from this portion of the body flows into the right lymphatic duct. And by this portion, I mean the right part there. And then the rest of the body drains into the thoracic duct. And all of this lymph then returns to the blood at the right and left subclavian veins. So the flow of lymph then really depends on pressurization of the lymph as the skeletal muscles constrict and pressurize the fluids and then the vessels themselves. And in the larger lymphatic vessels, there are one-way valves that keep lymph flowing toward the cardiovascular system, so prevent any backflow of the lymph. All right, so there's the lymphatic circulation, how we move lymph through the body and eventually get it to return to the blood. So along those pathways, we see the lymphoid organs, or the lymph nodes, but they're not the only lymphoid organs. The thymus and the spleen are also considered lymphoid organs. And they are, all three of them, essential to defense against the kinds of infectious diseases that can enter the body, along with the specialized white blood cells that do a lot of the killing and the destruction of pathogens or other non-self materials that might get into the body. And all of those lymphocytes are produced in red bone marrow. So we find, there where the other blood cells are being made, we're also seeing these white blood cells called lymphocytes made. And working with the innate defense, we see lymphocytes phagocytizing microbes and foreign materials. We also like the work of the natural killer cells that are taking out the virus-infected or cancerous cells. That would also be innate defense. Lymphocytes are also heavily involved and are the primary actors of the adaptive defense. And adaptive defenses rely on the activity of two types of lymphocytes, B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. The B lymphocytes, sometimes called B cells, and that's how I'll refer to them because I'm used to that more. These are the lymphocytes that differentiate and reach maturity in red bone marrow. And after they reach maturity, then they migrate out of the red bone marrow toward the lymphoid tissues, especially the lymph nodes and the spleen. T lymphocytes, they differentiate in red bone marrow. So they are they divide off of the hematopoietic stem cell, and then they do a little bit more differentiation, specializing, becoming lymphocytes. But then before they're fully mature, they migrate to the thymus. And under the influence of thymus hormones called thymosins, they mature into T cells, or the T lymphocytes. And once they reach maturity there in the thymus, then they migrate out to lymph nodes and to the spleen. And to other body tissues, but those are the primary locations. Okay, so those are the B cells and the T cells, and they make it into those lymphoid tissues as well. So let's look at the lymph nodes. Lymph nodes, as you saw in the earlier drawing, and that drawing, if you're looking for it in the book, is on page 481. Lymph nodes are found in clusters along the pathways of the lymphatic vessels. If you turn the page to 482, you'll see the same image that I'm showing you here on this slide. And so lymph moves into and through the interior of a lymph node. It first moves into the outer cortex, that's the light pink area. So we have multiple lymphatic vessels that are bringing lymph into a lymph node. It moves into this cortical region, and the sinuses, the openings there in the cortical region, are lined with phagocytes, and they're found around these large aggregations of B cells that are going to help to initiate the adaptive responses. And then it moves into the deep cortex, so here into these areas, where there are a bunch of T cells available. And then finally it moves out of the deep cortex and into, so out of the deep cortex and then into the medulla, so into these areas here where there are more B cells. So if we see these medullary cells here in this area. So in the medulla, that's where there are more B cells, macrophages, and then a kind of, it's an offspring of a B cell called plasma cells. Plasma cells are the ones that make antibodies. We'll talk much more about them in the next chapter. So as the lymph is moving through all these areas of the lymph node, the lymph is being phagocytized and the bacteria that are in the lymph are being phagocytized, and along the way that initiates this adaptive response. So lymph nodes are a big part of how we do immune monitoring, or in order to make sure that we are clearing out any pathogens that make it into the body. The thymus gland, it's found posterior to the sternum. It has a lot of lobes to it, and it's found at birth. But and it's relatively large in comparison to the size as humans mature, so that over time it doesn't grow as rapidly, and eventually it begins to shrink and is finally replaced by adipose and connective tissue in the elderly. But shortly after birth, it begins processing lymphocytes and releasing them as T cells. And it's the T cells that their primary job is to regulate the development of B cells into those antibody-producing cells, into the plasma cells. But some T cells also directly kill virus-infected cells. So we do see that there is some direct effects of T cells in taking out pathogens or things that don't belong in the body. So the thymus gland, again, under the influence of thymosins, this is where the T cells grow up, if you will, and then get involved in doing the adaptive responses. The spleen is found in the upper left quadrant of the abdominal cavity. It's kind of right there below the diaphragm, behind the stomach a little bit. And it's the largest lymphatic organ. It's good size. And it's similar, its construction is very similar to that of a lymph node. It has a capsule around it. It's got lots of blood vessels and lymphatic vessels in it. And this is a place where we filter, rather than filtering lymph, it is primarily about filtering blood. So it is to the blood what a lymph node is to the lymph, if that helps you think about it. So lots of phagocytes there that destroy bacteria, and along the way, because it's got such tiny little capillaries in it, this is a place where red blood cells that are aging will actually break up and get phagocytized by the phagocytes that are found in the spleen, and then we can recycle all the contents of the red blood cell. So it clears out dying or dead, or I don't know if that's, it's kind of weird to think about a red blood cell. It doesn't even have a nucleus, so it's hard to think of it as dying, but it clears out aging red blood cells. And it also has T cells and B cells, so it is also involved in stimulating immune responses and acts as a place where we do immune surveillance of the body. There are other lymphoid tissues as well. GALT is an acronym for the gut-associated lymphoid tissues. GALT includes the Peyer's patches. These are lymphoid nodules. A lymph nodule is an unencapsulated lymphatic tissue. So if the spleen and lymph nodes have a capsule around it, then Peyer's patches are lymphoid nodules without a capsule. The tonsils that are found in the pharynx and nasopharynx are also an example of a lymphoid nodule. So the Peyer's patches are a big one. It does immune surveillance of the food that is passing through the intestine. And there are other lymphoid nodules that are associated with the gut. We know about the appendix. That's another place where we have this lymphoid tissue. And all of this is about doing surveillance on the food that we're consuming, making sure that any toxins or bacteria are identified and removed. So we also see, as I was saying, similar nodules associated with the respiratory and urinary tracts. So we do immune surveillance throughout the body, and so those the tonsils are the lymphoid nodules that we find associated with the base of the tongue, in the pharynx, and in the nasopharynx.